Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 12 about Georgia's Constitution. It's Lesson 3, which will be our third lesson about Georgia history. In this lesson, you'll learn about the Democratic Redeemers, about Jim Crow segregation in Georgia, about the Civil Rights Movement in Georgia, and about the Great Migration. As we've gone through these three lessons on Georgia history, we've broken them up into different time periods. The first concerned the founding period, when Georgia became a state. The second one took us from the founding up through the Civil War. And this third lesson will cover the period since the Civil War. Now let me remind you about something we learned in the previous lesson, about the aftermath of the Civil War. In the aftermath, the South was occupied by Northern armies. Those Northern armies ran the South as a sort of military dictatorship for a while. So the people of the South weren't allowed to participate in politics as they otherwise would have, particularly those who had been involved in fighting against the North. In fact, Congress wasn't going to allow the Southern states to fully participate again in the Union until they had ratified the three constitutional amendments that were proposed after the Civil War. Now, eventually, Georgia would do that, but in the meantime, politics wasn't normal in the state. During the time period when the Northern armies were occupying the South, and the people who had actively participated in the rebellion against the Union were not allowed to participate in politics, politics was dominated by three groups. The first were the newly freed slaves, referred to as freedmen at the time. They had now been guaranteed a right to vote, and they exercised it. Now, they had been freed essentially by the Republican Party. The Republicans had come to power with Abraham Lincoln as their leader, as an anti-slavery party, and Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans were the heroes of the freed slaves. So they voted overwhelmingly for the Republicans. The second group that was involved in controlling politics in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War were called scalawags. These were poor white Southerners who did not own slaves, and therefore didn't really hold an allegiance to the slave party of the Democrats, and therefore were happy to participate in politics as Republicans, so that they could exercise some influence and some control over the government. Because they hadn't been active in defending slavery, they weren't barred and kept away from the polls either. The third group that was involved in politics during this time period were called carpetbaggers. Now, this was the description that referred to the suitcases that were popular at the time that looked like they were made out of pieces of carpet. People from the North who wanted to get into politics but felt like they couldn't really manage it back home would move to the South. So these were Northerners. They had been allied with the Union during the Civil War, and they were Republicans. They went south, they established residency, and they ran for politics, and they became both wealthier in terms of power and actual money from doing so. That's why it was attractive for them. So you had carpetbaggers, scalawags, and freedmen that formed an alliance that resulted in Republican dominance throughout the South, including in the state of Georgia. And this persisted until eventually the Union armies left and the state's control was turned back over entirely to its own citizens. That's when the Democratic Redeemers came to power. These were people who had supported the Confederacy, generally speaking, and then afterwards they supported institutions like the Ku Klux Klan. These were people who wanted to again regain a white-dominated society in the South, including in the state of Georgia, who once they were freed from the constraints of military occupation, used their power to intimidate others into getting out of their way, such as black voters. The cartoon here on the far right shows a black voter actually casting a ballot for the Democratic Party, realizing that it wouldn't do any good to vote for any other party in the South at this point. Because once the whites who had participated in the rebellion of the Civil War were allowed to participate in politics again, they were the majority in the South. They rejected the Republican Party as being the party of Lincoln, as being the anti-slavery party, They embraced the Democratic Party in the South, and they came into absolute power in states across the South, including in Georgia. Now, they were called Redeemers because they wanted to transform society back as much as possible within the confines of the amendments that have been added to the Constitution to the way it was done prior to the Civil War. They wanted to restore things to back to as they had been before the military occupation as much as possible. Now, once they gained power in the state of Georgia in the late 1870s, they then went about creating a new state constitution. The state constitution of 1877 was this Democratic Redeemer Constitution, where, among other things, they institutionalized segregation for the state, made it possible for all the various parts of the state, state government, local institutions, to set up segregated policies. So racial segregation then became a feature of the post-Civil War South, including in the state of Georgia. Here are some examples of signs and notices from the state. Now let me remind you, we've learned about racial segregation before in a previous unit, but let me remind you of what it meant. It meant that people of different races, while they may have been legally, technically treated as equal, they were required to exercise that equality, as much of it as there actually was, in different spaces. So, for example, there might be a waiting room at a bus depot for whites and a different waiting room for blacks, that kind of thing. Or there might be a swimming pool that only whites could use. So society was divided. The basic attitude of the white majority was, even if we can't treat the blacks as slaves anymore, have to give them equal legal protection, things like that, that doesn't mean that we have to actually associate with them. Now, this policy of racial segregation throughout the South, including the state of Georgia, went by the name Jim Crow. This is a reference to a character in a minstrel show, and it became the symbolic name for racial segregation. This was what was practiced in Georgia in the period after the Civil War. Now, the Jim Crow laws throughout the South eventually were changed because of the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement had a big effect, obviously, on Georgia, and Georgia had a big effect on it. Here's just a couple of reasons. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., hailed as the great leader of the Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and 1960s, was born and raised in Georgia. He had his first job as a minister here in Georgia, in the Atlanta area. And that powerful connection brought him back to Georgia. Even though he became a man traveling many places, it brought him back to Georgia often to help with things here. But there were other civil rights leaders in the South too. For example, there were those in what became known as the Albany Movement. This took place in Albany, Georgia, where the black community became highly organized and set about a string of demonstrations, protests, boycotts, sit-ins, things like that, to try to change the discrimination that they were feeling in that area. Now, this ended up not being successful, and the reason is that as people looked at it later, they tried to do too much. They tried to challenge every racist thing in their society all at the same time. And the police authorities that they were up against, which you can actually see in this photo here. This is the man who was the sheriff of the county that they were in, the white man to the side of the podium there where the speaker is. They had a particular clever way of dealing with this movement. They realized that just cracking down with obvious violence would then make them look like the bad guys, and so they decided to fight nonviolence with nonviolence. Whenever these demonstrations were undertaken, they would, as quietly as possible, arrest the participants for disturbing the peace, and then they would farm them out to small jails spread all around in the countryside. So they weren't concentrated in any one place. And they just tried to do this with as little conflict as possible so that there wasn't any fodder for the media to say about how brutal they were. And in the end, the Albany Movement kind of petered out without accomplishing much. The white majority there never gave in to the demands. The protests were broken up quietly. But this was an important lesson that civil rights leaders learned, including Martin Luther King, that they then applied to later situations. And that was to concentrate on one thing at a time, to really expose it. And along the way also to do enough to prompt the backlash that they wanted, so that that extremism being exposed could give them the upper hand in public opinion. Anyway, so the point is that the civil rights movement was very active and very important in Georgia during this time period. But even as the civil rights movement was going, life was still hard for blacks in the South, including in the state of Georgia. And this led to something called the Great Migration. The Great Migration took place in two waves between 1915 and 1970. The first wave was primarily in the east, and then the second wave took people from the south out to the west. In both cases, what was happening was blacks throughout the South, including from the state of Georgia, were getting fed up with life in the South and decided to relocate elsewhere, looking for a better life, mostly to northern cities. This is why, if you go to northern states today, while the countryside will remain generally white, the cities have large black populations. These are descendants from the Great Migration that took place. The Great Migration ended up leading to a dramatic drop in the black population of the state of Georgia. 1/3 of the people from the South that were of African American descent left for the cities of the North and the western United States. In addition, here in Georgia, those who stayed ended up moving to the big city of Atlanta, concentrating black population there and dropping it across the rest of the state. So if we compare population figures before the Great Migration to today, we can see the dramatic effect it had on the demographics of the state of Georgia. Prior to the Great Migration, whites made up about 54% of the population and blacks about 45%. So whites had a majority, but it was not an overwhelming majority. Because of the Great Migration, you look at today, whites outnumber blacks in the state of Georgia almost 2-to-1. Now, we have to be a little bit careful of these figures because you see a third group over there, Latinos, and they make up about 9% and growing of the population of the state of Georgia today. We don't have a separate figure for them in 1910. They were not counted in the census separately. Now, we have reason to believe that they were actually a very small part of the population in Georgia at the time, but they may have just been counted in with the whites and inflated that figure slightly. Now, if that's true, then that would make the white and black groups prior to the Great Migration even more closely about equivalent to each other. But that is now lost today. Whites, as I said, nearly outnumber blacks 2-to-1 in Georgia. And that has political consequences that we'll talk about in a later lesson. All right, let's review what we learned in this lesson, this final lesson about Georgia history. What did Democratic redeemers want to reclaim? Did they want to reclaim territory lost to the North in the Civil War? Did they want to reclaim pre-Civil War society and politics? Did they want to reclaim American pride? Or did they want to reclaim racial integration? The Democratic redeemers wanted to reclaim pre-Civil War society and politics. Which political party opposed segregation? Or I should say, I just misspoke, opposed. I meant imposed segregation. In other words, which political party brought segregation about in the South? Was it the Whigs, the Democrats, the Know-Nothings, or the Republicans? It was the Democratic Party that imposed segregation in the South, including in the state of Georgia. By the way, in case you're wondering, that name Know-Nothings, that was the actual name of a political party at one point in American history. What was the Albany Movement? Was it a series of civil rights protests? Was it a change in manufacturing? Was it an agricultural disease that was spreading? Or was it a political party conflict? The Albany Movement was a series of civil rights protests that took place in and around Albany, Georgia. What was the Great Migration? Was it a situation where Southern population grew? Or was it where Americans moved west? Or was it where blacks moved north? Or where debtors came to Georgia? The best answer to these is that it was a movement of blacks to the north. Yes, some of the blacks moved west also, and so you could use that, but the more specific explanation is found in the answer of blacks moving to the north. That completes this lesson. The next lesson will also be from Unit 12. It'll be Lesson 4 about the Georgia Bill of Rights.